Meeting is being recorded.
My background is basically I've managed an insurance agency and also have managed a division of an insurance company where we were one of the top writers of the National Flood Insurance Program. After that, then I've been consulting for about the past 17 years, providing outreach and insurance consulting services, including being 13 years on the national marketing campaign for the NFIP. Many of you may have known it as Flood Smart. The campaign still is going on, but a couple of years ago, FEMA did skinny it down and focus on more direct approach as opposed to a national approach. So it's still out there, and we'll be talking about some of those resources today. I have been also supporting FEMA Region 6 as well as Louisiana, and they are a cooperating technical partner, Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development, and the NFIP state coordinator overseeing the NFIP in the state of Louisiana. And through them, we have been presenting workshops around flood insurance to both insurance agents, realtors, builders, all trying to get them to better understand about flood insurance, about what the property owners may be asking, so you're better prepared to discuss flood risk and flood insurance with them, ultimately with the goal to have more people financially protected by flood insurance. With that said, this is the last of our webinar series, and we decided this time to focus on the aspect of what are some of the misperceptions and myths, et cetera, that are out there today, and how do we overcome those, and what resources are there to help. So with that said, the question to think about: what % of Americans believe that they are prepared for disaster? Now, in workshops that I've done, I usually raise hands and ask, and be interested to see what number you're thinking. But in the study, and even though this is a little dated, it's still very relevant. Only 16% of the people actually believe they're prepared for a disaster. And on top of that, 49% felt they don't live in a high-risk or an at-risk area. About the same number didn't know what to do. A third of them didn't believe really preparing was going to even help. And a quarter of them said, hey, I just don't have time. So what state are these people in? Some of you may say, oh, maybe Louisiana or whatever, but actually they're in the state of denial. So what are other myths do we hear out there? And at this point in workshops, I'd ask, what do you hear? What are some of the common things we hear? And when we did research during my days with the Flood Smart campaign, here were some traditional ones we had. I'm outside the flood zone, which, of course, we all know we all live in a flood zone. It's a level of risk that's different. FEMA does not map the no flood zone. It's either a moderate or low risk, or it's a high risk. The high risk are those zone A's and B's, and the moderate low risk are zone B, C on the older maps, and shaded X and X on the more updated maps. So other ones that we heard is, hey, you know what? The water didn't come up to my into my house last time. It only got on the yard, so that means I probably won't flood next time. Or I'm not even near water, so of course I'm not going to flood. Or, hey, that levee is there. That's going to protect me. And that's a phrase that often we try to stay away from saying protect, because it kind of implies 100%. You are or you aren't. And somewhat like our flood maps, you're either in or, quote, or out of the high-risk area, but actually that risk changes with many different variables. So living behind a levee gives that false sense of safety. And actually one of the top ones we still hear after all these years is my homeowner's insurance will cover me if it floods. And we know most don't, though we're seeing in the private world it's starting to creep up a little more. But even after the flood, one of the top ones we hear is, hey, the government's going to bail me out. Why? Because we see these headlines on the newspapers, $4 million, $50 million is given to a community or to a county or whatever to recover. Well, that money actually is going to rebuild the infrastructure and not really to individuals there. Unfortunately, we still hear today that some agents will say, I don't need the flood insurance. And another classic one was, it wasn't supposed to flood like for another 100 years. We had the, quote, 100-year flood 2 years ago, so we had 98 more years to go. So during the Flood Smart campaign of those 13 years, we were able to finally get the okay from the government to do some research. And we took a look at awareness and interest in the NFIP and in flood insurance, both of those. The idea was to give an insight on what are the buying and selling behavior of the homeowners, but also are there anything with the agents that we can help out with. And what we found through all of that was a consistent pattern, and that was back to risk, denying the denial of risk, that I'm not at risk, it's not going to happen to me. We've seen where they interviewed and their community's at risk, but they think they're not at risk. So here is a quick look at some of the findings. First, the good news. The good news is that not everyone lives in the state of denial. The study looked at why people did purchase flood insurance. And the top one was peace of mind. I got flood insurance because I wanted to be able to sleep at night okay. Another key one, though, was I know that the damage of flood is going to be expensive, and I don't have the resources or want to dip into my kids' college fund or my retirement fund to cover for that. The cost consideration was also echoed in the study of insurance agents. To them, the reason they recommended flood insurance, and most of you are agents on here, I know I have some company people, and I thank all of you for being here today. But the damage, they knew it was going to be expensive. They also said, hey, I want to have a lot of, or a complete quiver of arrows to offer the products and services to my client. And finally, there were, hey, they live in the floodplain, they live in a high-risk area. Of course, I'm going to recommend it. But why not? Let's look at the other side of the story, the reasons why people aren't buying and why agents may not be selling it like they should. Well, on average, more than 75% of the people felt that my home was not at risk. There's that denial of risk again. And many felt also that it was too expensive. But unfortunately, the agents were saying the same thing. My customer's not at risk, so I'm not going to tell them to get it. And anyways, it would be too tough for me to convince them to purchase it. So recommending, they didn't recommend flood insurance because they didn't think their homeowners were at risk. So we've got some at-risk, denial of risk popping up again even in our studies here. So then we asked the agents, what are the homeowners telling you? Because what I presented earlier was what they were telling us in our research. And again, what they were hearing from their customers was, I don't believe I'm at risk. Others would say, hey, I don't live near the water. And of course, then that cost thing came in. It's just too expensive. They're doing an internal benefit cost analysis, and they're just not seeing it there. And of course, then that equates at the bottom to it being a waste of money. So we saw similar results in a study that Wharton did. They talked to more than 1,000 homeowners in high-risk areas post-Sandy in the New York area, and the New Yorkers, they witnessed this huge major disaster. So flood risk was at the top of the mind. Wharton knew that at the time of the study. They were more likely than the population as a whole to acknowledge that there was a flood risk. So they got that. But they still underestimated, from their research pointed out, they underestimated the damage a flood could cause. Even in high-risk areas, they said no to flood insurance. because they didn't think they would suffer serious damage. So even in the face of a disaster like Sandy, there's still this denial to overcome, and you guys are living that day in and day out. Here's what you're hearing. Here's the misperception and denials you have to overcome. 1, and we're going to focus on 3 today. My home is not at risk. 2, I might be at some risk, but hey, how bad can the water damage be? And 3, it's too expensive anyway. You hear these great costs of thousands and thousands of dollars, so I don't have the money for that. So misperception number 1, I'm not at risk. So first thing to do is understanding that risk. Most are unaware that floods are the most common natural disaster in the United States, beating out tornadoes and wildfires, hurricanes, snowstorms, et cetera. Now, in Louisiana, that underestimating may not be as high. I don't have the separate data for Louisiana, but overall, they're unaware that the floods are the most common. Second, others think that because they don't live in this high-risk special flood hazard area, then there's no risk of flooding. So it's kind of like in and out. On the map, I'm in a high risk, or if I'm not in a high risk, then I'm at a no risk. And so therefore, they feel they don't need flood insurance. The truth is, and as I mentioned this earlier, these flood maps can be misleading for the average homeowner. So that's where you as the agents have to talk to them and walk them through what their flood risk is. And I'll give you a slide or two here to help show you how to do that. It's so easy to think that because the property is not located in a high-risk area, it won't flood. But we know it doesn't stop at the line on the map. We've seen that in Louisiana time and time again. Just think back, we had the 3-year anniversary of the 2016 floods there in the Baton Rouge area. In our study, we found the same thing, kind of like Wharton. Most homeowners underestimate their risk of flooding. We compare the homeowner's misperception of flood risk to the actual flood risk shown on the flood maps. And those with a policy even underestimated their risk, but those without a policy, high percentage, 70% underestimated their flood risk. We did have a percentage that did estimate it, but again, the majority of the people, even though they were in a high-risk area, underestimated their home's risk of flooding. So how do we overcome that? Key thing is they need help to understand the risk, and these tools are out there to help visualize. And what we find is visualization, showing, quote, a picture goes a long way. A lot of people are visual learners. For example, I have here, and it's a long URL, and again, you're going to get these slides, and they'll be hopefully hot linked, I believe, is to go into the flood map changes viewer. The Louisiana DOTD is helping FEMA update the flood maps throughout the state of Louisiana. In doing so, preliminary maps are issued, and when they are, you can actually go in and compare and take a look at what the current flood risk is based on the current map, I should say what the current map's flood risk is, versus what the new preliminary map is saying it is. And you can go to this website, you can put in a pin, and you can see the pin right there, and then click on Run, and what you end up getting is a report that compares the effective one, and you notice this one is just outside, so they're in a low-risk, minimal flood risk area, Zone X, and now in the prelim, you see that they are in a high-risk area, and the report provides you that information. This, agents, is a great way to show them how their flood risk is changing. And if you see areas that you are writing in are getting a new flood map, this is a great way of you to get ahead of the curve and say, I want to see how all my clients are being affected, and go in and find out, okay, they're being newly identified to be at high risk, or, okay, hey, they're going to be out of the high risk area, and there will be some cost savings there. Or if they're newly mapped in, newly identified to be at high risk, there's a newly mapped procedure to lower those costs. So be prepared and then have this visualization to help show them what those changes are. Of course, you can always go to the Map Service Center and just pull up the map if they're not going through that to help show them what their flood risk is. For those who live on the coast, I don't know if you're aware of this tool, the NOAA Digital Coastal Flood Exposure tool, where you can go in, this is Lake Charles, and based upon the different layers you see on the left-hand side, high tide flooding, the FEMA flood zones, hopefully we don't have tsunamis here, storm surge, and sea level rise. And you can turn on and off all of those layers. And you can do a composite there, as you see at the very top. It says flood hazard composite, which is a composite of all of these, and get a feel for what is the flood hazard in the flooding, the hazard flooding in these areas. So I picked one here, and if you look at it, you're pretty far away from the water source, but yet what this shows is you've got 6 different types of flood hazards that this area could be exposed to, and the different colors tells you how many, and then it prints up or tells you you're in a zone A and partially in a zone X. You've got a sea level rise impact and a storm surge from all 3 hurricane categories, 1, 2, or 3. But let's say you want to say, well, I just want to know about storm surge. I just picked one of those. And so you can actually pick those and move this blue dial to the right to see how much further this might go inland or how much deeper that water might be from the storm surge. Again, visualization, personalizing the risk, making it to them, that particular house, property, building, commercial structure. Finally, you may have those say, oh, it doesn't really flood a lot in here. Well, I picked the parish where I lived in for a couple of years, Lafayette, and here they've had 37 flood events just in the 10-year span from 1996 to 2016. So again, another way to help personalize the risk, say, yeah, it really does flood in this parish. So those are different ways to help personalize the risk. Another misperception out there was maybe I'm at some risk, but how bad can it be? Well, so once you've convinced the homeowner that maybe a flood can happen almost anywhere, and it does, next comes then the challenge of convincing them that they need to financially protect themselves from the consequences of flooding. So again, going back to that Wharton study, the New Yorkers, homeowners, understood there was a risk, but as mentioned, they underestimated the cost of flood damage. In fact, only 39% of those people, okay, almost 90% believed they were in a flood-prone area, but only 39% thought they would get damage from a flood and that would be costly. So now it's how bad can it be? Well, the agent's challenge then is to show them the value of flood insurance by showing them the cost of flood, but also the cost of the damage. Educate about the consequences. It comes down to how is this going to affect their pocketbook, their wallet. And this is a great tool right here, the cost of flooding tool. FloodSmart used to have one version on it for many years, and then now they've updated this so you actually have 3 choices of type of size of buildings up here, and you can click on one of those, and then you move this dial up and down, and how many inches of flood water you want, and it will give an estimate of what that flood damage might be. The beauty of this is it can be put onto your website today. You can go in there, you can download it, and that way when you're having that conversation, maybe they're not in your office, but on the phone, say, hey, listen, can you get online, take a look at this? You know, in this case, if you get just a foot of water, that's $72,000 worth of damage. Where are you going to get that money? Or maybe a better way to say, you know, do you have that money to recover? You know, or are you going to have to borrow it or get it from the retirement fund or the college kids fund, one of those, it's a serious consequence. So they may say, well, I've got disaster assistance. Well, it's important to remind the residents that in the event of a flood, yeah, the president must declare it a presidential disaster, but even then the assistance typically comes in the form of a loan that they have to repay with interest along with their existing mortgage that they have. And they're probably going to be required to get flood insurance as well. So flood insurance right there is a benefit. Another area that people like is a way to educate about the consequences is hearing it from other people like themselves. Research shows you're more likely to have action to occur if they hear it from many different sources, and one of those sources from people like themselves. And so keeping the tradition of the original Flood Smart campaign, updated survivor stories are available at agentsfloodsmart.gov that are in 30-second, 60-second, 90-second little stories, vignettes, that talk about how they've been affected by, and thank goodness we had, flood insurance. So I highly recommend that, again, put one of these on your website, download it, use these testimonials so that show it's more than just about the money, but it's also that peace of mind that thank goodness I had this. And these are true, real survivor stories on that. Finally, to educate about consequences, I'm going to go back to the cost. In Louisiana, and you can download this, I've tried to include links where I've gotten all this information. In Louisiana, the average NFIP claim for that 10-year period, 96 to 2016, was just around $70,000. Yet the individual assistance, now that's for people who didn't qualify for an SBA disaster loan due to bad credit or no credit or what have you, but the grant that you get from FEMA is only enough to get you back into the house. It does not make you whole. It does not help you repair and put things back together, just enough to get you in the house. And the average has been only $10,000. Yet the average claim has been $70,000 that's been paid. So again, educate them about the consequences that, hey, you know, if you get a disaster loan, you're going to have to pay it back. If you're counting on a grant from the government, it's not going to be a whole lot. Flood insurance is the way to go. But then the third misperception you have to get over is that flood insurance is too expensive. Now, admittedly, some policies for those living in high-risk areas can cost thousands of dollars a year. But the Louisiana residential premium in a high-risk area is around $1,000. The average claim you saw in a 10-year period was around $70. Spread that across more than 10 years is closer to $50. In the moderate to low risk areas, it's under $500 is the average premium, but as many of you agents know, you can get it for under $250,000 for a peace of mind if you're living in a moderate to low risk area. Yet the average claim is $35,000. Again, showing them, talking to them, letting them know that yes, you may hear that flood insurance is expensive, but it may be more affordable than you think. And strongly encourage them, especially in those areas where it's moderate to low risk area, to consider the preferred risk policy to help cover those small floods, big floods, the floods that you think won't come your way but do come into those moderate low risk areas, because we're seeing that more and more. And again, starts at less than $250 a year, I believe. In fact, under $200 you could go. And I threw one more example in here in the bottom of the slide of a Melda disaster there in Texas, a more recent one here, which showed that the flood insurance payout has been around $55,000, and yet disaster assistance has been under $6,000. Again, having flood insurance gets you up faster and recovered more quickly than having to rely on disaster assistance. So I want to include one more thing. So those are the three insights on ways to overcome some of the main objections. You've got to work the renewals. During the Flood Smart time, we also did analysis of lapsed flood policy holders and current flood policy holders. And here are some of the findings that we got. Many homeowners report satisfaction with their policy until the costs rise beyond a point, which is kind of an arbitrary. So they're going to be thinking, is it worth it? So then once that they've lapsed, a customer is likely not to come back. So you've got to, again, work those renewals. They feel, hey, I'm relieved of this financial burden. I'm really not going to go back and purchase the policy now. Personal experience will trump the federal risk classification. In other words, once homeowners see themselves how their property responds to heavy rains, it's difficult to convince them of a different outcome, and that's a challenge we have. So when you have the big floods of Baton Rouge, and you hear and it's in the paper and everywhere, but your house did not, you think, oh, well, then it's not going to happen to me. But I've seen this time and time again. The same thing happened in Atlanta several years ago in September. They had this huge flood after several days of rain. The storm came and just sat over them, and they had an incredible amount of flooding. And when I went to some of these open house meetings where there was map changes going on, they would say, oh, I didn't flood through the big rain that we had. But when you looked at the radar and where the concentration of that rain was, they weren't in that 100-year flood area. But their mind is set that way from their experience. So, again, we have to overcome that they're not at risk. But here's a promising one, if you will, is that low-risk properties in high-risk areas are opportunities for growth. So if you're going out and marketing and selling, think about those areas that are near high risk and also those who've had flooding in those areas, and look at saying to yourself, okay, I maybe want to contact my property owners, my homeowners that I have homeowners policies with, and get them to write the flood insurance, that PRP, give them that peace of mind that I've been talking about. Interesting enough, what we found, though, is avoid scare tactics. Use statistics to support, but don't go out there with big scare tactics like you're going to it's going to be the worst thing ever to you, whatever. They don't, most customers do not respond well to that according to research. And finally, make it relevant. Make it specific to your area. You'll get some outreach material from Flood Smart and FEMA, but if you've got more local stories, if you've got more local pictures, more local data, the more successful you will be in your marketing efforts to make it look like it's a local threat and not something national. So, have that flood talk. Your clients trust you, your knowledge regarding the risks about their home. That's why you've got to let them know that everyone can experience a flood. Just because you didn't the last time doesn't mean you won't. As you've seen from the research, most often homeowners' perception is that his or her flood risk is a lot less than what they actually think it is. Take time to remind them that flooding is the #1 natural disaster in the U.S. and in Louisiana. Flooding, if it rains, it can flood. And then next is the consequence. As I mentioned to you, have them understand what the financial consequence of flooding is, how it hits their wallet, their pocketbook, how it hits any saving plans that they're trying to put together for the future, whether it's their kids or for their own retirement. Homeowners insurance typically still does not cover flood damage. Disaster assistance is only available when the president declares a state of emergency, and then the funds are typically in the form of a loan that has to be repaid, or if not, you'll get a grant. As you saw, the grant does not pay out that much. And the maximum of the grant right now is around $33,000, $34,000, maybe $35,000 now. But again, you're seeing the average is like $4,000 to $5,000. Occasionally it pops up to $9,000. And it doesn't take a catastrophe to cause flooding. That localized storm that comes across, again, that 2016 was not a hurricane. Just several days of rain coming in and causing the ground to be super soaked, and then another storm coming in and just sitting. A few inches of water, as you saw from the cost of flooding tool, can cause tens of thousands of dollars in damage. So download that tool, get that there. The benefits of having that flood talk is, first, it dispels the misconceptions that we've been talking about. And avoid having those awkward conversations later when they're like, well, you didn't tell me. I didn't know. Sell that policy. In fact, there's a copy of my PRP up there right there. It'll help you better identify the coverages for them, and it reduces the errors and emissions exposure by you offering it and then having them sign that rejection form, and your own company may have it or your association may have one to use. This way, put it in the file and have it there so when they do say, oh, you never told me, you've got that rejection form. But what we find is that rejection form can also be a great sales tool, because as one agent told me when I was there in Baton Rouge giving the workshop, they said, you know, this is the kind of I am stupid form if they're going to sign it, but what happens is often they're like, well, maybe I'll consider some. Or, oh, yeah, I got to make sure I get property because, personal property, contents, because the bank is only requiring the building. And in fact, from Katrina going way back, the number one unheard story, sad story out there was, or untold, was a lot of people, yes, sadly got total damage or a lot of damage done from flooding. But what they found out was they did not have contents coverage. And the other is they did not have the full value of the building. They only had what the lender required, and so then they're like, how am I going to now rebuild? The house was worth $220, but I only had a loan of $120. Where am I going to get that $100,000? So use this form to help them think through one last time, and then, as I mentioned, it helps reduce your exposure to E&O. I'm going to stop right there. Again, this is not a technical workshop, but I wanted to just see Jerry Daniels, who is helping me with this today, to see if we have any questions in the chat. I'm not hearing Jerry say that we have any, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. Let me finish up. Thank you, Jerry. Let me go ahead. Again, if you've got questions, type them into the chat box. And again, we'll be sending this out to everybody. But what I'd like to do now is, as we've talked through some of the myths and misperceptions and ways to overcome them, you know, the denial of risk, or it's too expensive, it's not going to happen to me type comments. But what are the resources out there? And I was, in the webinars that I've done already and workshops there in Louisiana, I found that many people didn't know, some of the agents did not know the resources that are actually out there to help market and sell. So this next section, final section, will go through and highlight some of those. And again, go in and when you get this PDF of this, go ahead and click on some of these and take a look. The first is, as I mentioned, you've got a lot of map changes going on in the area. Where Louisiana DOTD is trying to, move along as fast as they can with the financing they can get from FEMA and their own to get these flood maps out there so people know what their current flood risk is. And when they do, they're posted up on the FEMA Map Service Center. And what you now can get there are not only the current flood maps and preliminary, but if you're doing any grandfathering, they're the historic maps. We now have interactive maps and do ferments. Now, the ferments is like a cutout of the map around your house and what the flood risk is there. And it used to be the old gray blobs, and some of them, that's all we have right now. But as we get the digital maps out there, we now have the ability to create digital ferments. And much better than the old days because you can see the property, you can see the home, you can put the pinpoint right where your home is and make a determination and visually show your property owner, your client, where their home is compared to the flood map and how close it is to that flooding source. You can go in and search for the different products that are available. Just go into the website, click on Search All Products, and put into, here I put property, the area that I'm looking for is Plaquemines Parish, and then down below it tells you, okay, in Plaquemines Parish we have the current maps, we do have preliminary maps out there, and actually we have historic maps, so, help with the grandfathering aspect as well. And then with the preliminary maps, we can get, and I showed this earlier, an example of this, where you have the preliminary map on the right-hand side and the current effective map on the left-hand side. Now, if there is no digital map, you will not have this bottom information necessarily filled in. But here we show this property is going from basically Zone X to a moderate risk area. But we're seeing that this area here is Zone AE now. So maybe if the home was a little further over, or the business in this case was further over, it might be at a higher risk. But again, a way to help demonstrate to the client how their flood risk is changing. How to use that tool, if you remember there was a really long URL at the bottom of the page, I've given you here a link to a fact sheet or tutorial tool to help walk you through how to use that website. Strongly recommended if you're in areas where the maps are changing. So where do you find that? We have mapping status, URL that you can click on that lists not only where the studies and where they are in the process of that study, but also if there's any LOMAs, layer of map changes in that community. So those are the different mapping resources that are available. I strongly recommend you check out what's going on in your parish, in your community. But then there is a website for the consumers, and hopefully most of you are aware of this. It's a great website. It helps tell them how to buy or renew flood insurance, go in and talk about the Map Service Center, how to look up maps, how to reduce the cost of flood insurance, some talking points of why you need flood insurance, and I'd go in there and read those and say, okay, I want to use those. I'm going to be consistent with the messaging that's out there. And, heaven forbid, but there will be claims, a way to file a claim, et cetera. So definitely a very useful website for the property owner. But now let's get into what's available for agents. First of all, agent training. If you're not aware, there's going to be, and I forget the number, we just added a couple new ones, agent training courses out there, about a dozen. Anywhere from basically about elevation certificates to map changes. If you've got new agents in your agency or you that are insurance companies that are online, go on to a basic agent tutorial. These are all online courses available. There are also webinars that they provide, and so there's a way to go in, if you go to this website, to sign up to get announcements of those so you can then participate in those online webinars. And occasionally they do actually go out into the field and they do in-person workshops as well. So definitely get online and sign up for the agent training if you have not. But from a marketing and sales support perspective, what's available. If you've not been to agentsfloodsmart.gov, you're missing out. And I would put this on your favorites, put a link on your home page of your computer, whatever it might be. First of all, at the top, you'll see the interactive cost of flooding tool up here. Again, click on that, download it, put it up on your website. I'll mention this one more time as you'll hear. But here's the areas that I'll look at. The getting started. If you're new, here's how to get started. If you've been writing flood, here are marketing and sales tools, and then here is how do you renew? Remember you heard me talk about the importance of renewing on there. So here are some tips about renewing. I'll cover that. And then they'll highlight at the bottom some campaign or something that they're doing right now. We just finished up the hurricane season, but the team known as C3 there created a whole set of marketing resources for agents to use. So let's take a look at a couple of these just so you know that's there. If you look at marketing, one, it identifies and gives you different ways where you can participate in campaigns, the resource library, but this goes in and tells you how do you create a marketing plan, for example. And I know from my days of agencies, we really didn't have a marketing plan. We tried something here or did this. I really wish during our days that we had the ability to do that. Then, as mentioned, there are campaigns out there. And I would go back and check with them to see how they're doing and what campaigns are out there. You can see the latest ones listed. They did one up in Midwest. Of course, the hurricane one. Recently, they did one in Puerto Rico to help encourage more people there, and then out in the West, flood after fire. So they have different campaigns going on. They talk about the importance of the surround sound effect, and what that means is, I told you earlier in the presentation, you're more effective if people are hearing the same message from different sources. That's the surround sound effect, and they're more likely to take action. So get involved, maybe go talk to the Realtors Association, Chambers of Commerce, find out ways to get your message about flood risk out there and the importance of flood insurance and how your agency can help them out. This is critical. Put this link here. There are over 300 resources here on the NFIP resource library that are linked. I've highlighted the different types here from brochures and fact sheets and flyers and infographics and postcards and template letters, a whole lot of information. And just in here, I think there was 78 different resources for you just around marketing. There's also social media, the videos that I had mentioned, and if you're putting together a flyer of some sort and you need an image, there are images here that you can freely use, or you can click on all and take a look at all 300 and some odd items. So lots of useful material so you don't have to start from scratch there. Then if you go into the selling one, highlighted up here as you can see in the yellow, it talks about where do I find new clients? Who do I suggest to partner with and how do I find them? So a whole section about finding new clients, but then a whole section about getting better to know and how do I reach out to my current clients, whether they're in high-risk areas or low-risk areas, type of coverages, et cetera. So again, some very useful information for that. And then speaking of existing clients, helping service them, whether it's during the time of claims, whether it's how best to renew, or they're going through a map change. And map changes, some of you have heard my webinar on this as well as workshops. This kind of simplifies and makes it easy on one page of how do I react, what do I do, what do I say when they're going from a moderate low risk area to a high risk, or they're in high risk and now the floodplain has shrunk and now we're in moderate low risk. They walk through in these pages the different things you can say, you can do, resources that are available. And speaking of the resources, you've got this resource library right here specifically related to map changes. So don't miss out on this if your area is going through or about to go through a map change. Finally, in those resources, I'm going to come back to it again, download this cost of flooding tool. Help the person that you're talking to across the desk, across the phone, look it up, have them understand the consequences of flooding. You help use the visualization to help show them that they are at risk, and then talk about the cost of flooding with this tool. And then talk about the preferred risk policy, because many of them will qualify for that it isn't as costly as you think it is. Or if they're being newly mapped, be familiar with the newly mapped procedure or grandfathering to show this is a way to reduce the financial impact. So hopefully through all these, you've in the past 45 minutes or so now have an understanding of some of the objections and how to use these tools to overcome those objections and how to more proactively go out there and market and sell flood insurance. If you do have any technical need of documents, put this website down as a way to find them all in one spot, whether it's about claims and underwriting, the bulletins, linking up for the training that I mentioned earlier. You can actually pull up reports that can be specific to Louisiana and the communities in Louisiana, and of course, download the Bible of flood insurance, if you will, and that's the NFIP manual. Make sure you're up to date on that, and you might subscribe for, I'll go back, these bulletins. They don't put out as many now, FEMA does, and some may not relate to you specifically, but it's a way to stay on top of what the NFIP is sending to your own companies, including changes in the program, the April updates, the October updates, and any others. So that finishes up the presentation. We've got about 10 minutes left for any questions. You have a representative there, Susan, on the left, contact information there. Gil Giron is your Region 6 flood insurance liaison. He's the specialist. Gil is very, very knowledgeable, not only in flood insurance, but on the disaster side as well as the floodplain management side. So he's got a good view of how all of the different legs on the stool of the NFIP tie together. So I'll stop there and see if we have any questions.
Bruce, there is one question sent to you in the chat. They're asking about a form, the selection rejection form, to be emailed out.
Yes, I can see if I can find that. That was a cord form that I had, and I don't know if it's the latest, but if I still have the actual, instead of the screen graphic, I will make sure to include that in when we send out to the PDF or the PowerPoint out to everybody.
Okay, that was the only question we had in the chat box.
Okay. All right, well, I'll keep this open for a minute or two longer if you've got a question. Again, thank you very much. I know we had one insurance company here that had many of their agents show up, so I appreciate getting the word out. If you do have questions or suggestions or recommendations, you've got my email right there. I'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, have a great remaining of your day and a happy Thanksgiving to you. And Jerry, thank you so much.